Hello, my name is Jean-Jacques Nantel. In this video I will talk about the geopolitics of China. It will be the fourth video of the series called Geography and Power, where I describe the strengths and the weaknesses of every great civilization of the modern world. If China has 1.4 billion people, it's because its population live on a very fertile plain where it is sometimes possible to harvest 3 or 4 times per year. That plain is irrigated by many rivers, the main ones being the Yangtze River and the Yellow River. The latter carries an average of 1.6 billion tons of sediment each year, which regularly clog the riverbed, and cause catastrophic floods. In 1850, such a flood changed the river's course and made it flow north of the Shandong Peninsula. The central plain of China, where 3/4 of the Chinese population live, is naturally isolated from the rest of the world by a series of natural obstacles. This is where most of the Chinese minorities live. While China's cultural sphere of influence has always extended far beyond its official borders, the country has always sought to isolate itself from external influences, for example, by building the Great Wall at the limit of its wheat-producing lands, or, if you will, at the southern edge of the steppe world, from which nomadic raiders so often emerged in the past. Since the Pacific Ocean is by far the largest and emptiest ocean of the world, the Chinese, whose civilization is based on agriculture, never became a seafaring nation. It is so true that they built the Grand Canal, which passes through their central plain, rather than using the Pacific Ocean, which is nearby. Culturally, the Chinese are so inward-looking that they always call their country the Middle Kingdom, despite the fact that it is clearly located at the extreme eastern edge of what geopoliticians call the World Island, which is the supercontinent made of Asia, Europe, and Africa. In China, it's striking. Everybody is afraid of something. Most people are afraid of wars, famines, epidemics, or natural disasters. The average citizen fears bandits, the police, the army, the government, their bosses, foreigners, etc. If it's like that, it's because the Chinese peasants, who were in the past the overwhelming majority of the population, have been isolated and unprotected for thousands of years in their farms with their wives, their children, and all their wealth. Individually, the Chinese are easily frightened and only regain their courage when immersed in an organized group. This explains why Chinese peasants have always preferred to live under a strong emperor who seemed powerful enough to defend the country, its border, and its laws. For everything else, the Chinese peasants lived isolated in their villages, not overly concerned with the orders given by the central government. The ancient Chinese used to say, "The emperor is far and the mountains are very high." It's important to understand that the Chinese authorities themselves have always been afraid of the Chinese masses. Their main preoccupation has always been to keep them under control by using violence against dissenters, especially those living in or near their capital city. Unfortunately, that systemic repression has sterilized the Chinese culture, which stopped producing revolutionary inventions like those it produced when China was divided in multiple political entities. Historians believe that China probably invented 19 of the 20 most important technical inventions made in ancient history. The Chinese authorities are so afraid of the Chinese people that in the past, most of them lived confined in fortified palaces like the Forbidden City in Beijing, where only high-ranking officials were allowed to enter. One of the consequences of that isolation was that Chinese leaders sometimes took stupid decisions that provoked the death of millions of people. It happened in 1958 when Mao Zedong launched his infamous Four Pests campaign, during which he ordered to kill all the sparrows that were supposedly consuming a large part of the crops. That campaign was so successful that the insects, which were previously eaten by the sparrows, proliferated and ate an even larger part of the crops during the following years. To stop the famine that killed millions of people, China was then forced to import 250,000 sparrows from Russia. In a country where the farmers and their villages have lived in isolation for thousands of years, people got used to solve any problem they had with the government by bribing the civil servants. In the Western world, people defend their interests by joining organizations such as trade unions, environmental groups, or student associations. In China, individuals defend their interests by using networks which allow them to obtain whatever they need without worrying about laws. In China, people always know someone who knows someone who knows a third person, and so on. While such a system is by nature peaceful and invisible, it created an almost uncontrollable system of corruption. Since agriculture, and especially rice cultivation, requires coordinated and meticulous efforts, the Chinese became hard workers who excel in fields where repeating thousands and thousands of times the same precise movement is necessary to become a champion. Chinese are often exceptional pianists, violinists, and billiard players. Poverty has also made the Chinese a very practical nation whose main concern is money. They are a sad and humorless people, but extremely efficient, productive, and frugal. In the religious realm, the Chinese have developed down-to-earth religions like Taoism or Confucianism, which are more preoccupied with preserving social peace than preaching about God. The great antiquity of the Chinese civilization has led the Chinese to always plan for the next century, while the Westerners, with their turbulent democracies, tend to plan for the next decade. It's so true that the Chinese have preserved surprisingly primitive cultural elements. This is the case of the Chinese writing system, which has over 100,000 different characters, while the Latin alphabet has only 26 letters. If this complex writing system has been preserved, it was essentially to maintain the unity of China, where the ideograms means the same thing in all dialects. Politically, this has always been important, since, as an old saying goes, in China, the spoken language changes every 10 li, meaning every 5 kilometers. Since we're talking about languages, it's worth noting that most Chinese people don't speak English, which, combined with their complicated writing system, make their nation unable to assimilate foreigners. I lived for 3 years in Shanghai University, and only one student, a guy from Cameroon, was attending classes in Chinese. All the others, numbering in the hundreds, were studying in English. The cultural attraction of China is so weak that hardly anyone can name an artist born in communist China. Anyway, for the Chinese, the country's internal problems are much more important than its international problems. Its leaders, in particular, have so much trouble controlling their hundreds of millions of citizens that they have no desire to conquer other countries and, above all, other nations. If they enjoy being courted, they are clearly bewildered by the overwhelming number of small nations that regularly come knocking on their doors. They think, but what are all those Slovenes, Bolivians, Lebanese or Zambians? It's precisely to protect their country from the internal disturbances caused by foreigners that the Ming Emperor of the 15th century ordered the great navigator Zheng He to end his maritime explorations. Finally, it was the Westerners who, in the 19th century, forced China to open its borders during the infamous Opium War. The British then built on the ocean the city of Hong Kong, located on an island near Canton. At the beginning of the 20th century, that aggression would trigger China's awakening and the end of its last imperial dynasty, a revival in which figures like Sun Yat-sen and Chiang Kai-shek played significant roles. Unfortunately, it was ultimately Mao Zedong and his army who won the civil war that followed the end of the Second World War. For the Western world, that victory of communism was a miracle. If Mao was a genuine guerrilla genius, which is why he won the Civil War, he was a totally incompetent economist. It was his economic foolishness that allowed the West to experience 3 decades of constant prosperity between 1945 and 1973. While Mao impoverished and massacred tens of millions of his compatriots during the Great Leap Forward and his Cultural Revolution, the Westerners were able to consume the cheap raw materials produced in the rest of the world. During those decades, very few people understood that. In fact, the idea that communism would eventually conquer the whole world seemed justified by the fact that between the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917 and the economic collapse of the USSR in 1991, communism had progressed on the planet at the staggering speed of 58 square kilometers per hour. Of course, communism theoretically survived in China since the Communist Party is still ruling the country. However, this survival is due to the fact that under Deng Xiaoping, the Communist Party decided to reject the idea of Mao Zedong by repeating that he had been right 70% of the time and wrong 30% of the time. To justify the return of capitalism, Deng Xiaoping famously said, "It doesn't matter if the cat is black or white as long as it catches mice." To modernize China, Deng simply copied what had been done dozens of times in the past by countries like England, USA, or Japan. He first opened special economic zones along the Pacific coast where the 40 million Chinese living abroad were allowed to exploit the hundreds of millions of poor Chinese peasants who then migrated to coastal cities. If the economic boom that ensued has been extremely rapid, it was because communism had lasted only 30 years in China. Unlike the USSR, where communism lasted 3/4 of a century, China under Deng Xiaoping still had millions of former entrepreneurs who remembered very well how capitalism works. To accelerate the development of the economy, the communists made sure that the prices of the Chinese products would remain unbeatable by investing very little to protect their natural environments. They also developed very cheap and inefficient social and judicial systems. In China, workers have very few rights and often have to wait for months to receive their salaries, which allows their employers to rob them if their enterprises go bankrupt. Even worse, the Chinese re-educated labor camps, the infamous Laogais, force their prisoners to work for private enterprises for extremely low wages. The industrialization of China has been so fast that the country has been thoroughly westernized. As a result, China has rejected its own culture. The only elements that survived were things like the language, the writing system, the food, the chopsticks, and the Chinese theater, which, by the way, is considered boring by the younger generations. This relentless westernization has been so systematic that the Chinese even copy our mistakes. Extremely intelligent and meticulous, the Chinese often improve the Western technologies, but rarely invent something revolutionary, which keeps them perpetually behind the Western world. The fact of the matter is that most of the modern technological revolution have been launched in Europe or in USA. The electric car, the internet, the reusable rockets, the artificial intelligence, etc. This is important since the Chinese economic catch-up is nearly complete. To keep growing, the economy can no longer rely on low-wages industries and must invest heavily in high-tech companies operating in fields like the production of computers, airplanes, or satellites. Since 1980, the Chinese culture has clearly been unable to follow the extremely rapid modernization of the economy. First, the Industrial Revolution has polluted the land and the water resources that fed China for thousands of years. Second, the urban revolution caused by the migrations of hundreds of millions of poor peasants toward megacities has transformed that nation of peasants into a nation of urban dwellers. In the past, there were always cities in China, but those cities were scattered all over the territory and were economically linked to the surrounding rural area where the majority of the population lived. Nowadays, the megacities are rather organized to export their products on the world market. In 2024, the country had 113 cities with populations exceeding 1 million. To house an ever-growing urban population, a forest of skyscrapers has been built in each of those industrial cities. As a result, the Chinese who used to live in small villages are now living for the first time in their history with the clear impression that their country is overcrowded. That urbanization process is so massive and powerful that it will soon create a megacity of 150 million people around Beijing. That crazy metropolitan area will be called Jingjinji and will include the cities of Beijing and Tianjin with their surroundings. The central government, which is as overwhelmed as the rest of the population by that gigantic transformation, claim that it is part of its central plan. In reality, Jingjinji will emerge by itself regardless of what the Beijing government says or does. Another revolution that is brewing in China and could explode at any moment is the fact that the Communist Party keeps governing an hyper-capitalist economy. The Communists, whose capital will remain in the overcrowded Jing-Jin-Ji megacity we just described, are perfectly aware of that contradiction and do everything in their power to destroy any organization that could eventually to overthrow them. In China, organized religions and beliefs like Catholicism, Islam, or the Falun Gong are practically banned, as are all the nationalist organizations of the Chinese minorities. This systematic repression served the communists well during the failed revolution that took place in Beijing Tiananmen Square in 1989, which collapsed due to the disorganization of the student leadership. After crushing that revolt, the communist government imposed a very strict control over all universities. For example, on the Shanghai University campus where I lived during 3 years, the campus was flooded at the start of every school year with thousands of unarmed soldiers who patrolled the campus streets during 2 weeks. These soldiers in uniforms were not military personnel, but first-year university students who were trained to follow orders. The ruling communists are also afraid of the capitalist entrepreneurs and of their powerful and wealthy networks. This is why, in November 2021, they did not hesitate to make an example of China's most powerful billionaire, Jack Ma, by sending him in a re-educating camp for refusing to obey government orders. This shows, incidentally, that money doesn't really rule the world. There are two things more powerful than money. The second one being violence, and the first one being a violent ideology like Maoism or Nazism. In China, there is a vast network of informants spying on the population, and countless prisons where millions of criminals and dissenters are incarcerated. Nowadays, a massive surveillance system using cameras has been installed all over the country to identify individuals deemed harmful. With the help of sophisticated computers, every individual appearing on a screen is first identified, and a more or less favorable score appears next to his head, which allows the police to decide whether or not to arrest him. Worse, all over the world, the central government has opened a police station inside each external Chinese embassy and consulate to monitor the activities of the Chinese nationals living abroad. In the case of the military, the police, and the other security forces, they are heavily infiltrated by the party and regularly purged by imprisoning or retiring their most competent and dangerous leaders. Finally, the government systematically uses propaganda and lies to hide its mistakes. In China, lying has always been an essential tool of government. All the statistics published by the state, such as the unemployment and the inflation rates, are falsified in some way. The communists are so afraid of the Chinese population that they triggered a demographic revolution by waiting far too long to end their disastrous one-child-per-family policy. Now that the population has started to decline, the authorities found out that the population doesn't care at all about the propaganda which aimed at increasing the national birth rate. There are many reasons for that indifference. First, the population has learned to scorn the official propaganda. If the communists can easily scare the population by using violence, they cannot do it when they face mass inertia, especially in a domain like the number of children per family, where decisions are made not by the state, but by each couple. There is also the fact that the million of small urban apartments built during the last 40 years allow families of only 4 people: the father, the mother, the only child, and the grandmother, who sometimes sleeps on the kitchen floor. Finally, there is the cost of raising a child in a culture where everybody's dream is to buy a car. All those transformations have permanently changed the nature of China. For the first time in their history, the Chinese are abandoning their age-old civilization to adopt a foreign way of living, ours. For the first time, the country is looking outward. For the first time, its economy has shifted from being agricultural to massively industrial, with all the environmental problems it entails. It is also the first time that its youth is highly urbanized and educated. As a result, 2 different nations coexist in modern China. The first one was born before 1960 and has been deeply traumatized by the Maoist massacres. The second nation is made of the millions of spoiled children born after 1970. Those 2 Chinas don't understand each other and don't even discuss. If it is like that, it's because older people didn't study and can't argue with the younger generations. There is a gigantic cultural chasm between the 2 groups. It's noteworthy that the younger Chinese tend to be much more decadent than their parents. Many young Chinese are overweight, refuse to fight to achieve financial success, or waste a lot of time playing with video games. They belong to what has been called the lie-flat movement. The relation between the 2 sexes are also pretty bad in China. Despite the fact that in certain provinces the boys represent 60% of the young population, 100 million young and still fertile women cannot find a husband. The reason for that imbalance is that men find modern women too picky and demanding. It's crystal clear that the Chinese culture has been unable to follow the rapid economic development of the country. On top of all those deep-rooted social problems, there is the present economic crisis caused by the recent explosion of the real estate bubble. As a result, a large proportion of the middle classes have lost their economies. In China, there are at least 65 million empty apartments which cannot be sold because they remain more or less unfinished. There are also dozens of ghost cities where almost nobody lives. In rich cities like Hong Kong or Shenzhen, some famous commercial streets which were full of consumers only 2 years ago are now empty. Since millions and millions of people are now unable to repay their debts, most stopped spending and a multitude of stores have closed. The demand for new buildings is so low that the whole construction sector, which used to employ millions and millions of workers, is slowly collapsing. The debt load is so high in many sectors of the economy that hundreds of banks could soon be bankrupt. A clear sign of the financial weakness of the country is the fact that hundreds of multinationals and thousands of Chinese millionaires are fleeing the country. The flood of foreign tourists has also weakened. Nowadays, the government can no longer hide the rising cost of living or the high unemployment rate, especially among young people. Due to the declining birth rate, the government is not even sure it will be able to finance the pension system in the coming decade. On top of it all, a series of climate disasters have recently devastated the agricultural sector. The local problems are so massive and complex that the population keeps repeating that the Communist Party has lost what the other generations called the mandate of heaven. At the international level, modern China must find a solution to the fact that it is an empire of the Far East. As I showed in the third video of this series, which dealt with Russia, Siberia is the world's only large reserves of raw materials located near China. Unfortunately, the Russians have developed the region by building its infrastructures in an east-west direction and not in the north-south direction, because their goal was to bring back the Siberian resources in Europe and not towards the Chinese market. Moreover, the main Siberian rivers flow towards the Arctic Ocean and not towards China. There is a demographic imbalance between the 8 million Russians living in eastern Siberia and the 100 million Chinese living in the former Manchuria. However, that imbalance is partly compensated by the presence of North Korea, which is a nuclear power and an ally of Russia. Finally, the Chinese living in the former Manchuria are leaving the region in droves, starting with the younger generation. The present geopolitical situation along China's northeastern border is so bad that a narrow strip of Russian territory prevents it from accessing the Sea of Japan. In all the other directions, China must pass through important geopolitical obstacles to reach the raw materials it needs to develop its economy. Along its Pacific coast, there is a long chain of islands and territories controlled by hostile powers such as Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, the Philippines, Malaysia, Brunei, Indonesia, Thailand, Cambodia, and Vietnam. Then there is the Pacific Ocean itself, which is the largest in the world and which is bordered on its eastern shores by high mountain ranges like the Rockies and the Andes. As a result, most of the American continent is oriented towards the Atlantic Ocean rather than towards the Pacific Ocean. On the Atlantic Ocean, the United States hold all the advantages and control all the region key choke points, including the Panama Canal, the Bering Strait, and the future Northwest Passage. To put it simply, China is and will remain unable to secure an autonomous access to the Atlantic Ocean, an ocean where the richest and the most populous countries of Europe, Africa, and the Americas do business. In Asia itself, as we mentioned earlier, China faces the clearly insurmountable barriers of the Himalayas and the Gobi Desert on its southwestern and western borders. In the past, only high-value goods like silk were traded in that direction. And that's not all. Beyond those geographical obstacles lie numerous enemies against whom China frequently fought in the past, especially India, which, in the coming decades, is expected to catch up and even surpass China in nearly every domain. In reality, Asia is a continent where many nations dislike each other and where numerous endemic conflicts simmers. Just think about the hatred the Japanese created against themselves during the Second World War when they brutalized many nations, including the Chinese, who dream of taking revenge if history ever allows. In China, everyone remembers the bayonet massacre of 200,000 residents of Nanjing in 1937. There is more. Despite its 1.4 billion inhabitants, China faces in Asia itself a human mass several times its size. Since everybody is afraid of China, we can say that it has no real ally on the planet. Geopolitically speaking, she doesn't even control any significant strategic point, including on the Pacific Ocean. Besides Japan and the two Koreas, few countries on the planet have communication lines as long and as vulnerable as China's. In fact, it was to improve its access to the world resources that China decided to develop the two modern Silk Roads, the Continental Silk Road and the Maritime Silk Road. In the 21st century, only two states on the planet will be populous and powerful enough to oppose China's ambitions: India and the United States. Fortunately for them, this should be relatively easy since the Communist Party made a series of stupid mistakes both domestically and internationally. Domestically, the party erred by eliminating all opposition, making it impossible to revise or abandon harmful decisions made by the country's leaders. The best example of this is the former one-child policy, which promises to depopulate the country in a few decades. The current government also realized that by maximizing urbanization, it has destroyed the rural farming population, which has always been the country's true source of strength. Massive urbanization also created numerous high-value targets for potential nuclear attacks. Meanwhile, the unrestrained capitalism the party allowed to proliferate has led to the import of hyper-polluting industries which poison the land, the rivers, and the natural environments that fed the population for millennia. The problem is important since China has only 7% of the world's drinkable water. During the COVID-19 pandemic, authorities also made the mistake of imposing an extremely frustrating nationwide lockdown for many months. Since then, the anger has been simmering in Chinese cities and the government now fears for its survival. Internationally, the party has wasted a fortune to build the infrastructures of the Continental Silk Road, which crosses several Muslim countries while simultaneously brutalizing and imprisoning members of its Muslim minority in Xinjiang. There is also an inherent contradiction between the need to develop the Continental Silk Road westward and the natural movement of China's population towards the major cities located on the East Coast. In the case of the Maritime Silk Road, the Chinese Communist Party has used its fleet to seize control of several small islands belonging to other countries in order to dominate the South China Sea. This short-sighted decision was stupid, since China's future will depend on peaceful trade with the rest of the world through the Malacca Strait. Of course, China is currently trying to open autonomous access to the Indian Ocean by passing through Thailand and Myanmar. However, this will not change the fact that India will always remain on the northern flank of that famous maritime Silk Road. The same applies to the continental Silk Road, which passes within a few hundred kilometers of the northern Indian border. To control China, which is currently experiencing a significant demographic decline, its 21st century's adversaries should exploit all the internal and external problems we just described. The first thing to do will be to create economic and military alliances with all the countries which fear China and its leaders. It should be easy to do, since China has 14 immediate neighbors, which is a record she shares with Russia. Such a strategy, based on wearing down the opponent, should be easy to put in place for a maritime power like USA, whose two immediate neighbors, Mexico and Canada, are allies. Another weakness of modern China is the fact that in case of a war, the Chinese families will be extremely reluctant to the slaughter of their only child. Before wrapping up this video, I'd like to make one final comment about China. Historically, when the Chinese have been attacked by a smaller nation, their instinctive response has never been to retaliate with violence. This is what Westerners and Muslims normally do. No, their reflex has been to build a great wall. Obviously, a nation who responds this way and waits 4,000 years to conquer a rich and empty territory like Siberia is not a dangerous nation. The fact that China is led by an extremely brutal communist party doesn't change this reality. If you want to learn more about global geopolitics or about the massive economic crisis that is beginning, feel free to check out my other YouTube videos on these topics. The next video of this series will focus on India's geopolitics. Thank you in advance for liking this video, for sharing it with your friends, and for subscribing to my channel. It's very important for the algorithms which control the internet. Bye.